Hey everyone, Temporal here, and for this session we are going to talk about the bands that have been selected for OWL for their June Joust. So we're going to talk about what these are. We'll talk a little bit about what they are, potentially going to do in terms of how often these heroes were being played, maybe a little bit of insight into, well, how does that affect what can be played? Take, bad guesses at what it's going to be in terms of going from there, as well as sort of a discussion of general thoughts of do these make sense? Should these be in the league? So, to start with, what the bans are, they are up here on screen. This shouldn't be really shocking to anyone. We're looking at, or excuse me, what they are shouldn't be shocking because you can see the screen. Maybe they're not the ones you would have guessed them to pick, but we see Tracer, Sombra, Reinhardt, and Zenyatta. And these are kind of important because these have all been seeing play in one form or another. Probably the two most common comps in OWL have been the Brawl comp, which was using the Reinhardt plus the Diva plus the McCree and the May and the Bap and the Lucio. That was probably the most common. And obviously we see Reinhardt was in Brawl, so that checks that off. And there's not really a great replacement to that. You don't really want to go, okay, well, let's replace our Reinhardt with something else. We can run replacements. We have seen evolutions. For example, when Goats went away, the first meta that got run after Goats ended up using the Orisa. It was the Orisa Diva plus Reaper plus May plus Moira plus Lucio. That was the, or no, was it Moira? Yes, it was Moira. Like, this is the comp that got run immediately after Goats went away, and Goats was a Brawl comp. Well, now if we have a Brawl comp go away, would we see something like this? Could we just see something like, oh, substitute Orisa in? The modern Brawl comp has more poke than the old Brawl comp did too, and that it's running a McCree, it's running a BAP. Those are real poke factors. If you swapped in Orisa, could you run something like this? Would it work in the same way? Well, maybe. So that's one thing that could potentially be explored. Maybe we'll circle back to that. But hey, could we just go minimum changes? Let's change the Orisa. Now, obviously, there's more changes around it, so we can't discuss it in a vacuum. But that is something that we could go, hey, there is precedent for seeing a swap like that. That is a good point, though, Levy. Reinhardt is a fan favorite. Why was he banned? Who knows? He already had the nerf that happened to his armor. He lost the 50 armor. He didn't have it converted to health. He straight out lost it. So he's at the 500 pool again and, lost the extra 50 armor, not at the 550 pool. So that's gone. That's something to think about. Is this the end of Brawl? Are we just going to see more mobile all the time? Well, maybe, maybe not, because let's move on to our next ban. The next most common comp was the double bubble, and that was run with a core of Winston plus Zarya, and then Brig and Zen. That was the core of it, and then it used one of effectively 5 DPS, not one of, 2 of 5 DPS, and those could be Tracer, Sombra, Hanzo, Echo, McCree were all common. You could see an Ashe, but these were probably the most common 5 DPS to pick to fill out your double bubble. And obviously, when I talk about Brawl, there were variants besides the McCree plus May. Every once in a while, you'd see a Reaper in there. You were seeing, of course, Sim in there, a bunch from Dallas. You'd, of course, sometimes see Doomfist in there. Occasionally, you'd see a Junkrat in there. But the standard version was that. There's less of a standard for what this is. Because you were seeing a little more variety to it. Regardless, this is the core of our double bubble, and what we see is that 2 of the heroes that were frequently in double bubbles, the Tracer and the Sombra, are showing up here. So Tracer and Sombra. So these were double bubble heroes. That's what they were primarily used in. You'd occasionally see a Tracer in Brawl, for example, but that's primarily what they were used in, and these are both gone. Does that spell an end for double bubble if we get rid of Tracer and Sombra? Well, probably not. I mean, you can still go, hey, it's much more poke focused. It would be much more, hey, we are relying on Hanzo's, Echoes, McCree's, maybe Ashes. But the sort of punishment for running real poke heavy stuff was to make stuff more dive heavy, and we've taken away some of the best dive heroes. We've said, no, you can't have Tracer, and no, you can't have Sombra. So what good dive heroes are left? Well, the best dive heroes remaining for DPS are probably actually Echo and Genji. And Echo was already being run, and Echo's a flexible hero. She's a poke dive hero, so maybe we just pencil in Echo here, but maybe we don't actually pencil her in because you can't run hard enough, so maybe you're just better off with double hit scan. And if you're better off with double hit scan, well, while McCree was good for his flexibility of being good poke and standing up well against dive, if you're actually going and standing up well against Echo, if you're actually going into a, hey, no, we're in full poke mode, maybe we are at a point where it makes sense to go, okay, we don't need this anymore. We want to go more fully into poke. So now maybe we're going to pull out Ash plus Hanzo, just as an example. And those are going to be fine. We, look at this and go Ash plus Hanzo, or maybe Widow in here. That's going to beat the McCree setup, so we don't want it. But maybe not, because if we're doing that, these guys don't stand up nearly as well against the bubble dive that comes in from your Winston Zarya. So maybe we still do want to hold on to this McCree. That's going to be a tough sell. And if we do go, no, we've evolved towards the Ash, Hanzo, Widow, something along those lines without the McCree, maybe, the McCree does float, and we say, okay, let's ditch the Zarya in that case and make this actually have something that enables poke better, because Zarya doesn't stand up terribly well in poke comps. Would it make more sense to get out a diva in that case? Or would it make more sense to go, hey, maybe we're going to go Orisa Diva, Ball Diva, something along those lines? Would it make more sense to get back out the Sigma? Most of these are better in poke than Zarya. Zarya doesn't stand up pretty well in matches where 300 damage headshots come through. She doesn't stand up well to that. Her bubble doesn't interact well with it, because Zarya needs to be able to use her bubble when she's taking and can expect to continue taking damage. And with these extreme bursts that actual snipers pull out, that's just not Zarya's favorite to play in. She can't reliably get energy. She just gets deleted. So this becomes probably the most interesting thing that I've seen here. The problem that leads us a little bit away, though, is, again, if we're not doing our Winston plus Zarya, well, then the Ana becomes, excuse me, this was an Ana, not a Zen. I don't know why that, what did I have here? Bap Ana, not Zen. I don't know why that was a Z. Let me erase that. So the problem is, again, from there, we'd evolve, and you guys can see how the thought process works. If we'd evolve to go, okay, well, if we're, not running this because we're running these, maybe we get rid of the Ana and run a Zen, but we can't run a Zen, and we'll come back to this Zen later. So maybe this is a case of, okay, we're back, and we're back to, it's our Winston, Zarya, Ana, Brig, and we're going to keep the Kree because we want to keep some level of defense against this scary Winston dive, and McCree's still well-tuned. But then what is it going to pair with? Is it going to pair with someone who fights the McCree well, can't be a diver? So, I mean, it could be a diver, but it's not going to be Echo. So is it going to be Genji? Well, Genji doesn't do well in that matchup either these days. Even when Genji, quote-unquote, wins the matchup, the 25 extra HP McCree has swings it. So that's going to come down to, well, is it just McCree Ash? Well, if you're running the Ash, do we want a Mercy? Well, but then if you run the Mercy, you get overrun by this. So this really becomes an interesting equation of how does this evolve? Because my best guess is if something like this sticks around, probably we are looking at something like this, where it's going to run double poke in there with one of them being the McCree, keeping the Brig, doing all this. And this would probably be, at least in my thinking, and I haven't thought terribly hard about this so far, this is probably the closest to what we're looking for. And this is McCree. I suppose I can throw that there, not a May. So that's currently the closest thing. Now, will we evolve past this as time goes on? Almost certainly. Metas will evolve. But the first things that coaches do and players do when they're looking at what do we do with no metas is they're going to look at what can we run that is either abusing the most powerful heroes and then build around it, abusing heroes that were powerful that were being checked by heroes that have now been banned, or are the least amount of changes to the things that we've practiced. So like an example of that would be when we went from goats to the Orisa, Diva, Reaper, May thing, that wasn't actually the most powerful comp on that patch. We can almost guarantee it. But all of the players were so practiced at playing Brawl that it was the smallest adjustment to make. And it was better to do something that the players had put the last year, the last 9 months into practicing, to put them on something similar to that, than to swap into a hard poke with many angles type thing, even though that was probably now better because it was going to take time to retrain players up to that level of poke play, if that makes any sense, which I hope it does for you guys. So my guess would be something like this would be the first place that the meta goes, and then it evolves as, people figure out the better stuff. Now I think we're going to pivot over and talk about what Zen does, because there was a comp that used Zen that was also seeing some meaningful runtime in Owl. But let's take a look here on chat real quick. Peak Overwatch, 2 Orissas shooting at each other's shields. That didn't actually happen in the Orisa meta I was talking about, but yes, that is a frequent Orisa wonder. And they wonder why Overwatch League has poor viewership. Double Shield again, or Winston Diva Rush. Could be Winston Diva Rush. Winston Diva Rush has certainly happened. Or deathmatch comps again like last year. We'll see. We're piecing it together, guys. I mean, I've laid out what I would put as a guess, not like I'm putting all my money on this. I haven't really thought about it that seriously, but from my perspective, we just walked through one thought process that could get us to something like this. So let's move on, and let's go ahead and get to the last comp that we haven't talked about. Not the last comp being run in Owl, but the other comp that uses something here from Owl, and that would sort of be I just call it the Ball Zen comp, because it's a poke comp, but it's a comp that uses Ball Zen. It tends to then use Diva these days, and it's clearly inspired from the old hybrid comp. You could potentially run it with Sigma. Sigma's not garbage anymore. You're then going to run that with the Brig to go with the Zen, and then you're going to run generally some sort of poke heroes with it. That might be Ashe, that might be Echo, that might be Tracer. Tracer fits in there. Oh, can't run our Tracer there, so that's a problem. But you could run something like this, where it's some combination of like Tracer, Ashe, Echo, something like that is generally what you do. McCree, again, those kinds of things. And this is clearly inspired by the comp that was run late in 2020 that was, I called it the hybrid comp. Now I call this the Ball Zen comp. Well, that's off the picture. So Ball Zen comp is now out of the picture. And this comp did fine. It was probably the most poke-heavy comp that was being run in Owl, because Double Bubble is really an ult cycling comp. It's got some dive elements with some ult cycle to it. And Brawl is, of course, a Brawl comp. It's a hybrid between Brawl and Poke, but it is, a Brawl comp at its core. So we can't really run this because Zen is out of the picture, and there's not really a good substitute here. Like, your next best poke support DPS would probably be your BAP. And if you run the BAP, you don't really need the Brig plus BAP. You could do it. You could make this go full poke. You could go something like Ball Diva, and then we still can't run the Tracer, so maybe we're running Ashe plus Hanzo, Ashe plus McCree, whatever. And then if we're running the BAP doesn't usually need the peel of a Brig, and you also almost certainly don't need a Brig. If these two are off the table, Brig is effectively off the table. Brig, you don't need her. Like, it's not like she's completely gone. If Double Bubble lives, she'll live, because the threat of the monkey jumping on you could potentially be enough. But Brig almost gets to be removed from the table, because the things that she shuts down have been in some ways removed from the table here. So then you go, hey, if we run this BAP, we probably want to run a Mercy to lean back into our poke. Oh, what do you know? We're back to talking about a poke comp. Maybe we have an Orisa, maybe we have a Ball, maybe we have a Diva, maybe we have a Sigma. But we're really back to talking about a poke comp here, which shouldn't really be surprising, right? Like, when we really look at what this thing does, even though Zen is a strong poke support, a very strong poke support, if we look at this, we've removed probably the best dive hero in the game. We've removed probably the second best dive DPS. Not the next best dive hero, but the next best dive DPS. We've removed a near essential, not 100% essential, but a high priority hero for Brawl. And we've removed a high priority hero for Poke. But this looks to lean more towards Poke to me in terms of what's available, because, and the reason we get there, even though we've removed a high priority for each of those, is because we get to our counter triangle, where, hey, Dive tends to counter Poke, Poke tends to counter Brawl, brawl tends to counter dive. Well, if we've weakened both brawl and poke, and we've gutted dive a bit harder, well, poke beats brawl. Poke looks like where we should lean. Poke looks like where we should lean. This isn't perfect, and we'll get to the counter example in a couple seconds, but we look at this and we go, okay, so we're probably looking at a strong poke comp, and we're probably looking at a strong poke comp that is using, I mean, if we look at the strongest poke options, those are going to be BAP plus Mercy. That's your strongest support line, and that's where we think about this to start because that's our most limiting factor for our poke right now. And then from there, well, McCree's the most overpowered probably hero right now, so we've got that. Then we have to figure out another thing. Ashe, Hanzo, Echo, Widow, something in that realm probably makes sense, though maybe we need to hybridize something else in here to protect us. Maybe we need a Genji in here to help protect. We've seen poke comps. One of the Chinese teams really likes their poke comps that uses Genji. I think we've seen Architect come out on Genji a lot of times. Maybe we've seen more than one team do that on Rialto, where they'll run a full poke comp plus Genji, which is, how they've hybridized it in. And then we get to our tanks, and we've talked about our tanks. You've really got 4 options there, and we're sort of going in circles here, but you could have Orisa or Ball, depending on how you want to set the comp up to succeed, and then you could have Diva or Sigma for much the same considerations there. So this looks like something in this range looks most likely to me, but we have to think about, okay, well, what still exists? And we talked about that double bubble thing. The other thing that we've talked about, or that we haven't talked about, or there's 2 more things that we could talk about. We could talk about, well, how could Rush survive? And one is with the Orisa swap for the Reinhardt. Okay, something that evolves from that could be real. The other would be the Talon dive, the Winston Diva Rush, whatever you want to call it, where you've got Winston Diva, Moira, Lucio, and you can't run a Tracer, and you can't run a Sombra, and usually it's Tracer, Sombra, or Reaper, some combination of these 3 that got run in there, and we can't really do that. That's not an option, and the strength of this comp was that it was undivable, but this is a good comp at punishing comps that are sort of compromised. Brawl comps that didn't go full enough brawl. Poke comps that didn't go full enough poke. It does a good job of punishing both those things. You've sort of got to lean hard into doing what you're doing. And if you don't, this comp does a pretty good job of just wet blanketing you, being like, nope, you're not allowed to have any fun. But with these 2 removed, you could run Reaper. Plus what? You don't really want to run a McCree. The McCree's just going to get blown up if you're playing mirrors. So that's not great. That's not great. If you're playing mirrors, I suppose it doesn't really matter because you've established that it is the meta. But the Reaper usually, or the last slot usually would be too punishable by other dives. But again, other dives aren't really an option. So you potentially get something in here that can't really be Dove. Maybe that's a poke DPS, maybe that's like a Mei, so we could talk like a Mei, a Widow, something that can position far away, or something that also has an invulnerability cooldown. So maybe something along these lines. So like, we could have a Talon Dive type modification, we could have a Orisa Brawl type modification, or we could have a poke comp. Those are probably the 3 things that are left on the table from here. And you guys can see I'm clearly just doing some processing, thinking out loud on stream here in terms of where we go. I wouldn't be surprised, or we've got the double bubble thing that we talked about, which is a double bubble. A double bubble poke would be a poke dive hybrid at this point. You're still bringing enough to enable the dive, etc. So those are sort of the places that look most likely to get experimented with, to get played with, in terms of what I would expect teams to try to quickly scrim to go figure out, and then figure out what reigns supreme there. In terms of what would reign supreme there between those, tough call. That's a really tough call. I would probably guess that it would be something in the poke world, not so much the double bubble world, maybe, but probably the poke world. But I wouldn't put strong money on any of them right now. I just thought I'd walk through some of my thoughts there so that you guys could see, hey, what are things that could happen? How would this work? I'll answer some questions now, and then I think we'll move on to what are my general thoughts. And as well as you guys, you can participate in the discussion of what the thoughts are on, hey, why do we have bans in the first place? We just had an extremely diverse meta, and what about the other levels of play? Are they going to affect them? Okay, so I don't think we'll get deathmatch comps with Tracer and Zen off the board. I don't think that'll happen, Nordstrom. Okay, not seeing any questions, so let's now go ahead and move on to talking about thoughts on what this does. What if they banned Diva, May, McCree, and Lucio instead? I mean, fine with me. That would be fine with me. It would do completely different things, and that's like its own huge tangent blah. Sorry, I think that's too much of a tangent for me to tackle, because if they banned Diva, May, McCree, and Lucio, the first thing teams would go to trying would be double bubble. Like the first thing that teams would go to trying would be double bubble because it doesn't affect it really at all, and you'd probably see more of these two used because no McCree on the board means, oh, we can do this. And they might have evolved from double bubble. No, they can't evolve from double bubble into full poke. They can't evolve from double bubble into full dive without Diva, though they could run Winston plus ball, but I don't think that's what we'd actually see. I don't think Ball's strong enough. I think Briggs is plenty relevant. So you'd probably stay on double bubble with these two to start. Tifa, May, McCree, Lucio. Yeah, that's probably what you'd run. I think there's still enough checks from dive to not let poke run supreme with those bans in place. So I think what you'd end up with is dive, which isn't terribly surprising. I mean, you banned out a bunch of Brawl heroes, and when you ban out a bunch of Brawl heroes and really don't touch any of Dive's options other than Diva, and that matters, you are going to end up in a similar situation where, hey, if we think that when they did the most damage to Dive, they did the most damage to Dive and they did even damage roughly to Proc and to Brawl, we expect Poke to win because Dive is their counter and is shut down. And here, this would be the most damage to Brawl. This would be the most damage to Brawl, and even though it does some damage to Dive and to Poke, Poke, it's still likely to leave us in a dive state just on the surface level because again, Brawl would be your best answer to Dive. Dive is your best answer to Poke. If Poke and Dive both get a little weakened and Brawl gets removed, you're going to lean towards Dive. Now, McCree is a pretty Brawl heavy Poke hero, but, Diva is whatever. We'll get to it. So my guess would be something in the double bubble range that is leaning more towards Dive with heroes like these two. Okay. Temporal approves of those bands. I'm good with that answer. Are these the actual hero bands? The actual hero bands are the four that you're looking at on the screen. Yes. For the June Joust, these are the four that you're looking at on the screen. Yes. I'll pretend that Temporal said, I think your bands are better than those, Bluff, but enough. Because Zen plus Sombra were barely played in comparison to the others. Unlucky. I agree. Okay, so that brings us on to what does this mean in general for the competitive and the Overwatch scene. I don't love it. I'm not a fan of bringing back hero bans like they have. There's a couple things that we run into. So the facts on the ground that we need to be aware of is they announced this months ago. They didn't know that the meta that we would be in would be as diverse as it is now when they announced that they would be doing these now. So you can give them a little bit of forgiveness for that, but I don't. And I'll come back to why I don't in a second. I think in general, they've been a little too afraid to make changes and they've let their game stagnate from a Owl standpoint in ways that have been really damaging to their IP, to the success of the league. I think letting Goats run for basically all of Season 2 and not just nuking it was extremely bad for the league. Like, the success of Owl, Season 2, Goats, all the way through, huge mistake. And they were too timid in making changes. And I understand why they were timid in making changes. It's like, oh, competitive integrity, we don't want to do this, etc. But you're trying to make your franchise successful. You can't. Like you literally can't do that. You knew that that was going to be terrible for viewership. You knew that you were burning out pros. We know that, season 2 did significant damage to the trajectory of Overwatch, or of Overwatch League as an esport. So like that was a mistake, and it looks to me like we're making a similar mistake again. We have a great meta that people enjoy watching with a lot of diversity to it, and we're going, oh, well, we said this, so for the sake of competitive integrity, we're going to do this. Well, remember, guys, to be an esport, yes, you need competitiveness, but you also need people to watch it to enjoy it. This is again the same issue that they ran into in season 2 when they did preseason games, and all of the coaches or whatever, maybe it was the players, decided, we need to protect our strats. We don't want to show anything. So they did silly stuff like teams wandering out and playing goats with everyone on the wrong heroes, where the main tank is playing flex support, where the main support is playing main tank, where the, one DPS is playing off tank, where they did things like that to hide their strat so nothing could be scouted against them. And the fans were rightfully extremely disappointed with it. And remember, that stuff doesn't happen in preseason football, in preseason baseball. You might see a team wanders out with, hey, we're going to field 6 subs and only 3 starters, and we're going to swap out 2 of our starters as the game goes on, and you might end up in an 8-1 scenario. And we're totally fine with that in preseason for baseball, for football, for any of those things. But the thing is, the scene is mature enough and the organizations actually understand that when they do something like this is still a spectator sport. This is still a league that needs the success of fan investment for it to work. It is not all about, well, I'm going to hold on to my 0.02% competitive advantage by not showing you this thing. Like, we weren't saying, it wasn't a they needed to roll out with their absolute best strats. They could have run previous metas. They could have rolled out and played dive like Houston at the time did and just been like, we're going to play a previous season's meta, but we're going to play it the correct way. And that's fine. And the fans would have been totally fine. But the joke that they did got them backlash. And I think they even had to make a comment on it. And you'll notice they haven't now been doing lots of preseason stuff. And there's a reason for that. They have to understand that this requires fan investment. Like, you have to put on a good show. You have to put on a good show. Yes, you need competitive integrity, but you have to understand that there's a bit of a scale to be had with these things, this competitive integrity versus entertainment. And while you can't just be like, we're going to throw out all the competitive integrity, you can give up a little bit of competitive integrity of, we said this was how we were going to do it, but it's just too good, so we're not going to do it this way. And what do you know? Would more than one team even have objected? Would one team even have objected? I don't even know that they would have. So you can go, hey, we're going to give up a little bit of competitive integrity to make this better to watch. And the reality is they already do that. They already do that in other places. We see our tournaments. The competitive integrity in tournament brackets, for example, would be, hey, we're going through our winners bracket, whatever, they're all pairing down, and we get here. And what should happen in a truly competitive integrity environment would be, hey, the winner in the finals over here, the person from the winner bracket versus the person that came back up from the loser bracket, the person from the winner bracket, if they lose, should get another match down here and then get a second chance to go fight for the grand finals again. But we don't do that in most online tournaments, in most esport tournaments. And the reason we do that is it's not good from an entertainment perspective. We understand that it's not good to go, hey, is this the grand finals or is this the grand finals? Well, if these guys win, this is the grand finals. But if these guys win, the grand finals won't be until 2 hours, 3 hours later. That's very bad from a spectator standpoint, so you don't do it even though it hurts the competitive integrity of your game, because it's not fair that these guys lost once and they got eliminated even though the other guys lost and had to fight their way back up, etc. That's not fair. And we try to mitigate the not fairness by either giving, hey, maybe the score starts as 1-0 in map score, or maybe we give these guys extra map picks, but those are not as valuable as getting the chance to lose and come back up again. So competitive integrity is already, for the sake of audience, for the sake of entertainment, being, the trade is already accepted there. This is something we have to understand. So regardless of whether this was announced, this should have been backpedaled on. That is my take. And I don't think it's a particularly hot take. I just think I can explain it better than it's generally been explained. Okay. The other issues that you run into is, we're just doing this for Al. If we're just doing this for L, we're not doing this for contenders. Well, that's a problem, because if we're not doing this for contenders, we end up in this situation where Owl and contenders are on different patches. It's hardly the first time that's happened, but if they're playing different metas, you can't let your contenders guys get be good practice for your Owl guys. They're not going to scrim against each other. This isn't amazing because it means that the next rank of talent, it slows down these guys' development, and you want these guys developing better to go up, but it's not actually the end of the world. It's not like we haven't done this tons of times before where contenders and Owl are on different patches, and there is some level of self-preservation there where the Overwatch ecosystem likes to keep a little bit of division between them because it likes to pretend that Owl players are more better than Contenders players than they actually are. And it likes to do that because it is safer for a franchise that required a $20 to $60 million buy-in to pretend that they're the best, even when you have Contenders teams that would pretty solidly be middle of the league or even higher in some cases. So I understand, like, this isn't the worst thing. They've done it before. I don't particularly like it. I have objections to it, but this isn't the biggest objection. That said, it does look pretty weird, and it is going to hurt your contenders viewership more, unless people just hate this, to go, hey, this game is different than this game, which, might also be different than this game. We've got our ladder. Oh, shoot. We have our ladder, and our ladder isn't like out. We've always had the patch problems with this, but this is going to be even more extreme than patch differences, literally removing the heroes. And I'm sorry, if you're trying to make your esport, your viewership thing successful, and you have the game that the pros are playing be so much different than the game that your people on the ladder are actually playing, it's going to be really hard to get serious fan involvement. Like, they're not watching the same game. Like, it's meaningfully not the same game. And there was always gaps. There was always gaps of, like, okay, organizational play allows dive to happen in Owl in a way that it just doesn't happen on ladder, especially a low ladder. Overwatch League allows poke to happen in terms of timing peaks, piggybacking off of each other's peaks and Owl in ways that doesn't happen on ladder. There's always been some limitation. I get that. But we're making this more extreme than we have to, and if we're trying to have a successful professional sport, this isn't how you do it. You don't try to magnify those differences. Like it's such a silly mistake to be making, and I'm disappointed that they're making that mistake again this deep into their success, especially after they've been bringing on more and more professional sports people into the ecosystem and less esports people who have a little less experience, and you could understand getting this wrong. That said, the professional sports people have mostly been around in a place where they already had successful leagues and they have no idea how they got there either. So maybe the esports people were better. Okay. I think I've berated the league and its silly mistakes enough at this point, because that's what this video turned into: meta predictions and berating stupid mistakes from the league. Let's go ahead and catch up on chat. Balance for fun metas with niche heroes greater than balance for equalized pick rates. Reasonable take. Why do they keep making decisions that make them look so incompetent? Well, to be fair, sometimes there's a no-win. Like, decisions, when you make decisions, are always going to piss off one group of people. There's always multiple groups of people, and almost every decision you can make is going to piss off some group of people, and you don't always have the best feedback mechanisms for, if you have Group A and Group B, you don't know necessarily how big the two groups are. And if you make a decision that Group A is happy with and it really pisses off Group B, like, let's say Group A is 90% of people, but Group B is 10% of people, but it really pisses off Group B, and Group B is really loud about it, you might misunderstand how big Group B is. So, like, I'm not claiming it's easy to understand and make all of these decisions. They made wrong decisions here. I illustrated why they made wrong decisions here, but I do have some sympathy for it can be hard, especially in the online world. This is just like when companies incorrectly respond or incorrectly take Twitter too seriously. They don't recognize that, hey, literally 2% of 2% of Americans, for example, and that is, I'm using Americans as a proxy because Americans are, one of the basically the largest consumer market here. 2% of Americans actually have or have Twitter accounts or post on Twitter, but companies disproportionately react to Twitter mobs, Twitter getting upset, Twitter doing things, etc., not properly understanding that that's 2%. Just because they're really loud about something doesn't mean that doing what they want is actually going to make the other 98% happy. Now, does this 2% does this 2% represent more than 2%? Yes, but we don't know if it represents 8%, 15%, 80%. We don't know. So we have to be very careful about using this as data. Audience feedback from their being loud, group B, in this case the 10%, being loud and complaining about something doesn't mean that it wasn't the right decision. And you can say, but temporal, you're just referring to the silent majority concept. And the silent majority, well, if they remain silent, they're not going to be heard and they deserve what they get. Well, you can say that if you want, but I want that silent majority watching my thing, whether they're actually invested enough to really make noise about it or not. You don't just want the most invested people to have their way necessarily in this type of situation, because you won't make enough money if the group that isn't loud is too big. Like that's how it works, and we've seen that. I think we're seeing that. I think we're likely seeing that here. We've seen that with reactions to what happens on social media. That's how this works. You have to actually do your own stuff. You have to go get your own data out there. Maybe that's pushing out survey data and finding ways to get it out to people who are less likely to be engaged. Maybe that's pushing out surveys in Overwatch itself. Maybe that's going into the Overwatch client and pushing out a survey to go, hey, we're going to push out a survey and we'll give you 50 owl tokens or whatever for buying a skin if you fill this out, if you fill this out for us. And maybe you do that, once, a couple times a season, something like that. Like, it doesn't really matter, but you find ways that doesn't just get the super fans because the super fans aren't enough, or doesn't just get the people who go and cry the loudest on Reddit or on the Blizzard forums or whatever, because that's not enough. You have to find ways to reach them, and you have to invest in getting that proper market data, which again isn't news. That we know how to do this. And if you don't, Blizzard should reach out to me because I know how to do this and it's not even my specialty. Okay. Just more reasons to watch Contendies instead of Owl anyways. I'd agree with that, Levy. And it looks like, I think I saw news that they're lightening the restrictions on advertising for Contendies. Maybe it was for Owl. I'll have to look again. But if they're lightening advertising restriction for Contendies, that helps. That helps a lot, because that was one of the things that made it hard for contenders to be successful. Again, I'll go a little behind the scenes here. There's a significant list of things in contendees that you cannot get as sponsors. You can't get them as sponsors. You need Blizzard's approval on who you can get as sponsors, and they have a list of industries that you can't get as sponsors. And the list is simply too big. And the contenders list is even bigger because they want to redirect some of the things like sports drinks, like cars, like computer peripherals, up to Overwatch League. So they don't want to let you go get a Mountain Dew sponsor, for example, in contendees, because they want Mountain Dew to have to spend more money on an Owl sponsorship. So even if you're running a contenders team, you have an org, etc., and you're like, hey, we're good at sales, we know how to do this, Mountain Dew was willing to invest a few $1,000s to get, to get us to promote their team a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. That's been removed from the table because they want to force Mountain Dew to have to spend more in Overwatch League. I'm using Mountain Dew as an example. That didn't specifically happen, but that's the sort of thing that exists. So you have to get real creative in contenders and who you can go get as a sponsor, et cetera. And that's part of what has stifled contenders. They've sort of it's been unnaturally starved to go, hey, we're going to try to force some of these people up to Owl where they'd have to pay more, even if the contendees could do a better job of getting them, even if some of these brands would go, we're not willing to spend that much, but we're willing to get in here, and maybe in the future you could convert them up to Owl. That'd be great when they're willing to spend more. But some of these guys are going, we want to get our toes wet in this advertising space first, and they're effectively not coming in the first place. But I get it. You're trying to force the money up because the league didn't have the revenue goals that were necessarily expected, and you're trying to again protect this $20 to $60 million investment that teams made. Like, I understand why it's happening. It's just again a mistake. But if they're lightening restrictions, if what I think I saw somewhere is real, was it in this article? No. If that's real, that would be good news, especially if it applies to contendees. Okay. Um, do you buy the idea that the meta would get stale and less diverse during the June joust with hero bans? Potentially. Metas almost always get more stale. Metas get more and more solved. It is an amazingly diverse meta that we've had recently, and it's lasted in a diverse state for much longer than most metas do. I can almost guarantee you, though, that if it keeps going, it will get less diverse. It might get more diverse at first, but eventually metas get solved to a part where they get very stable as basically one comp for a very long period of time. And then maybe after some amount of time, there's a big shift in people's understanding, and the meta completely changes again. But like, by and large, yes, you would expect at some point it would very much stabilize. So would it happen over the next month? Probably. But could there be a spike for a week or so first? Yeah. Um, I'm I'm okay with doing it with the normal patch way though. Like, keep in mind, I'm okay dropping another patch that is, well, we think things are too stale, so let's buff the bejesus out of, I don't know, Hammond, nerf the bejesus out of McCree, you guys will figure it out. Because again, that changes it for everyone. It's like, okay, and even if it doesn't change the meta you had was diverse enough that it's probably okay. It's probably not the end of the world as you continue through for another thing there. But at least everyone is sort of thinking about playing the same game with the same heroes. There's not a, why is Owl playing that absolutely wacky comp? Oh, because they can't get dunked on by dive. And even a weaker Tracer, even if Tracer got nerfed a little, Tracer Sombra should be able to dunk on some of the poke comps that will potentially come out because these two literally can't get played. So I buy it a little, but not really in this case, and I'd rather they just go, okay, we're going to nerf and buff something. Do you taste the rainbow? What is your favorite flavor of two and Skittles? Um, ooh, I mean, I don't really drink soda that much anymore. When I did drink soda, probably the Code Red Mountain Dew, but that probably dates me because that stuff's real old. I don't know if that still exists. Probably the Code Red. Um, Skittles, sour Skittles. I kind of like to see mastery of comps rather than diversity. I know I'm the minority though. Yeah, I understand what you're saying, Nordstrom, and some level of mastery is appropriate, and I as a coach like that too. But I really enjoyed goats. Like, I didn't really have a problem with goats other than the fact that for some of my DPS players, they can't actually get scouted. The problem with goats, one of the problems with goats from a pro perspective, was what you ran into is you would have hit scan and flex DPS players that had good Briggs and Zaryas, but you couldn't really get promoted from contenders to Owl based on a good Briggs or Zarya. Because everyone was like, yeah, but we don't know how you do on your real, on the real heroes for once this meta's over. And it's like, okay, but the meta's been going for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. So they like couldn't get promoted even if they were good at the heroes that they were supposed to be good at. And even if they were really good at the other heroes, they couldn't show it off. And even if you put them in a tournament with bans or stuff, like Jane did one tournament during that, etc., it's like, yeah, but this isn't real type stuff. And even if you put them in Owl tryouts and it's like, okay, we're going to do Owl tryouts, no, we're not going to take anyone after all. Because you run into the problem of, okay, yeah, we saw it, but how real is this? Like, no one's practiced on handling them and this and that, and we don't have enough basis for comparison, etc. So it did some problems for player longevity for players. It was very hard to move up at a time in Overwatch's history that was still pretty young and early. So it was that problem. And the more serious problem is what I've been talking about this whole time, which is, yes, I like that. And maybe I'm part of the 2% that's being super loud about liking that. But that doesn't mean that that's what, and the 2% does represent more than 2%. Maybe the 2% actually represents 27%. And then maybe there's another 20% that just doesn't care one way or another, but that still leaves what? The remaining 53% that would desperately prefer that they get to see some widow action, some tracer action, some hog hooks, whatever the case may be. Okay. Um, the real problem with goats was that Sigma wasn't out yet to have Sigma goats. Okay. Okay. I think that's going to do it, guys. If you guys have questions, go ahead and throw them up in chat now. I'll hold it open for another minute or two. If you guys are enjoying the content, please do like and subscribe. That helps me out quite a bit, and I really do appreciate it. It also tells me if you guys like this type of covering the news type content as opposed to just going reviews, reviews, reviews. I come from a coaching background, so reviews are sort of my bread and butter for stuff right now, but I do get the sense that there is a hunger for a little bit more content like this with, my coaching background perspective. So let me know if that is something you guys want, both by liking the video or disliking the video, and by commenting below the video here. If you guys are looking to get coaching yourself, because that is a service I offer, you can join my Discord and see what my rates for that look like. And you can also in the Discord, see what sort of promos, events we have coming up, whether we're doing server pugs, whether we're battling another server's team in, a scrim, whether we're bringing on a new interview guest to talk about Owl contenders, data about Overwatch, whatever the case may be. Okay. Uh, Giving it another 5-10 seconds for questions to show up here. Not really seeing them. Filling time, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I think that's going to do it. Thanks, guys. Temporal.